Mary and George, a show where a demon twink and his handler infiltrate the bed of James I and VI.
He will be yours, mine, ours.
Hi, welcome to my review of the hot, new, sexy Jacobean drama based on Benjamin Woolley's 2017 book, The King's Assassin. This show explores the life of George Villiers, the first Duke of Buckingham, and his mum, from 1592 to 1628. Through the orchestrations of his mother, the beauty of George elevates him to the position of royal favourite in the court of James I and VI. I say VI because he was also the sixth King James in Scotland, but only the first in England. Everyone seems to forget that. I'm going to try and keep plot point spoilers to a minimum, but this is going to be a review of the fashion and the beauty trends from a historical perspective within it, so there will be spoilers. So was the namesake of the King James Bible actually gay? Firstly, we're going to discuss the issue of sexuality. This show is quite bold in its representation of same-sex desire in Jacobean England, especially in the sexual relationship between George and the king. A lot of articles I've read that were like reviews of the show talk about historians being squeamish to label the sexuality of historical figures like James and like labeling sexual orientation in history. This is quite a contentious point. I think when historians nowadays are hesitant to label something as homosexual, that's less from the point of view of some stuffy, conservative old historian who's not kept up with the modern world or whatever, but more of an understanding from historians that sex and gender as we understand it today is a very modern concept. Modern sexuality is modern. Therefore, to label someone in the 17th century with the word like gay can be considered anachronistic. Gender was a completely different concept in the Jacobean period, and therefore sexuality was too. I will be the first to admit that I have and am regularly guilty of these anachronisms. But when we look at the sexuality of a figure like King James I and VI, it's something we have to keep in mind. However, this show is not an academic journal, it's television. These shows are to be watched by a wide range of people, not just someone who spent their life studying the history of sex and gender. So we have concepts and stories that need to be conveyed through these shows, and these are ideas that need to be legible for everyone. For this reason, I think there's something to be said for anachronisms in period dramas. In Mary and George specifically, I think they actually did a really good job in showcasing some of these ideals and this sense of a more fluid, sexually liberated court. I don't think there's any specific language that references modern homosexuality, but from what I've read, I think a lot of people who were involved in the production of the show definitely considered George as someone who was gay. Today we call it twink death. In the 17th century, it might have been understood as the changing, evolution and development of one's gender. Now I'm going to focus on one of the less well-known stars of the show, facial hair. When understanding gender in the early modern period, historians like Thomas LeCure will explain it as a degree of difference to manhood and masculinity, rather than a polar difference in one's genitalia. For this reason, other historians like Will Fisher discuss how other visual characteristics like facial hair are as important to the construction of one's gender as genitalia and sexual organs. In this understanding, beardless boys might be considered a different gender to bearded men. If a woman is a lesser degree of a man, so too a boy without a beard is also a lesser degree of a man. They're both different. There's even some speculation from historians that a beardless marriage might be considered sodomitical, given a beard shows one's ability to reproduce, and a beardless marriage is therefore unable to reproduce. So when we consider the relationship between someone like George and King James, in this show we might see how facial hair can serve to gender them differently. If we look at portraits done of George, like this 1616 one, we see a difference in the facial hair of his youth as a lover to the king, whereas towards his later years, especially after the death of the king, he's consistently represented with facial hair. As a man later on, his power is less derived directly from the king, especially after his death, and he's a man with his own standing in society. When he doesn't have a beard, his power is derived from his relationships with the king. When he has a beard, he's a man in his own standing with power to call himself. If I have one criticism for the show, it's the fact that at the end, before he dies, after the king is dead, he doesn't have a beard. Put a beard on that man, it's important. What we can see in the relationship between James and the king is one is evidently older, bearded, is a man. George is gendered differently. With his lack of facial hair, he's a boy. He's almost in the way that a woman is not a man, a boy is not a man. And that's really shown visually in this show. There's a lot of argument for historians that it's less about what sex, as in male or female, someone is, and more about an expectation for submissiveness in the acceptability of these relationships. Despite what roles they may or may not play in the bedroom in this show, the lack of the beard suggests submissiveness. Now let's talk about female agency in the show.
If I were a man, and I looked like you, I'd rule the fucking planet.
Female agency is another really important aspect of the show, given that it's George's mother, Mary, who orchestrates his rise to power.
My son. He is subject to my rule. He is my George.
Actress for Mary, Julianne Moore, puts it, Mary is someone who has no autonomy and no agency and no property and no value except through the men that she's married to or her male children. The agency of a woman is a seriously debated subject in the early modern period. Serious questions over gender and the role of women were developing at the time, and James's predecessor was the Virgin Queen Elizabeth I. Costume designer Annie Simmons talks about the dressing of Mary as a modern woman with suit-like elements, and talks about her wearing a proto-feminist leather jacket when she's in London. These are definitely noticeable elements of the show. I think in the costuming, there's a lot of focus on Mary's doublet, which is essentially the predecessor to the suit. And you notice this in the way she moves, in the way she carries herself when she's in the room with men. Her costumes definitely have a suit-like quality, which is useful for the modern viewer to read that as more masculine. She needs to show off these masculine qualities in order to have any agency in her life. Should you take a girl swimming on the first date? Well, writers from the Elizabethan and Jacobean periods certainly think so. One scene I found particularly powerful on the subject of female agency is Mary's first appearance at court. Here she wears what's considered prostitute makeup and an ensemble reminiscent of Queen Elizabeth I. Annie Simmons explains this choice as Mary wishes to draw attention to herself in court. She certainly does so, but this attention is often discouraging remarks and being laughed at for her fashion choices. If we consider this scene from the lens of female agency, however, there are some really cool aspects. Firstly, the clothing and the makeup that Mary wears is certainly intended to remind us of Queen Elizabeth. She was the previous monarch, the Virgin Queen of England, who served as ruler without a husband. Her own agency and power is certainly a reference point for Mary. However, crucial to this scene is her makeup. Before she arrives at court, Mary has her lover, who is a prostitute, do her makeup. Criticisms of makeup in the 16th and 17th century are very similar to today. They argue that women are deceptive. Jacobean writers stop just short of telling men to take women swimming on a first date. Specifically, the use of makeup is referenced to prostitutes.
Are ready for the king.
A key criticism of makeup is that women engage in the act of self-transformation, that in practicing art on her body, a woman disrupts the divine order of God, husband, wife, and holds power over herself. The act of wearing makeup can be considered a reclamation of female agency. Many of these criticisms were written during the reign of Elizabeth I, who is famous for her use of cosmetics. And yet, the writers focus on harlots, prostitutes, and the lower classes in order to fall short of criticising the monarch. They're less keen on overtly criticising the Queen. And so in referencing Queen Elizabeth, Mary not only likens herself to the agency of the Virgin Queen, but so too references her own power of self-transformation that she held as ruler. and this is pivotal to the messaging of the show. Gay son or thought daughter? Well, send your child to France and they'll come back as both. That's how the English feel about their southern neighbours. In the beginning of the show, Mary sends George to France to learn their courtly ways. French court in the early modern period was famous for its display culture. Obviously, the most famous point of this is Versailles in the 18th century. From this point of view, it really makes sense that George is sent by his mother to go learn this practice in France. It's here that he gets a kind of culture shock and develops from the more uptight English child we see in the kind of somber, colourless clothing he wears at the beginning of the show, and develops into the ideal courtier wearing these lovely blues and much more expressive clothing. In fact, George Villiers was known as the most beautiful courtier in all of 17th century Europe, and these changes in fashion reflect the development of his character. When we understand the French influences on George as a character and his costuming, we need to understand that at the time, England and France often conceived themselves as these kind of opposing, polar opposite cultures. Nonetheless, a lot of English courtiers and aristocrats would adopt continental manners, fashions, and influences. You could describe the character of George Villiers in 17th century language as a gull or a gallant. This is a kind of archetype of a vain man who likes his appearance too much, but also gets around. In the start of the 18th century, you might call this man a fop. At the end of the 18th century, those who want to mock him might call him a macaroni. And in the preceding centuries, the word dandy might be more applicable. Really, maybe today we call him a metrosexual. But it was understood that a lot of these effeminized men were the result of corrupting French influences on the English way of life. This period of history is what happens when you give theatre kids a crown and an army at their disposal. Lots of prancing and lots of dancing and lots of murders. As I've mentioned before, the court of James I and VI was a performative space. 2 years into his reign, he abolished sumptuary laws, which were like laws that told you what you couldn't wear based on your social standing. This meant that now a lot of rich families had a larger scope for the ways that they could display their wealth. In terms of performativity of the body, George is the ideal man. The sequence of George being introduced to the king that we see in the show is actually quite well documented and quite accurate from what I've read. And it was a mask ball in that he first really caught the king's attention. The mask balls were a powerful way to show off the power of the body in this period. Rest in peace, George Villiers. You would have loved colour theory and Drunk Elephant. In the court of King James, beauty is power. For kings, princes, and dukes, the colour of your face reflects the health of your people and your lands. So Nicholas Galitzine was such a good choice to play George, and he is so pretty, which is really important for the story. I found it interesting that Nicholas's beauty seemed styled slightly differently to the other boys of the show. Given that a key point in the story is George's beauty, it's really important for the audience to genuinely find him attractive. I think this means that there were certain beauty standards or certain ways that the real George might have actually looked like that were excluded from the show. This includes certain hairstyles, ways that his face might have been coloured, and facial hair in the later years. I think this is actually a good choice, although the way he looks might be anachronistic or incorrect if this was a documentary. If you spend too much time trying to conform a character to the beauty ideals of the 17th century, you risk losing the impact of their beauty on a modern audience. This is something that I found with a lot of shows, especially from like the Regency period, where with the male love interests, they always keep their sideburns. And like, I get it, like this might have been the fashion and way to do hair at the time, but it does nothing for me. It doesn't work for me. And so any plot point that balances on the attractiveness of this man is just lost. I only got like halfway through the Pride and Prejudice film. The sideburns were too much for me. I think a way this can be seen is in the scene where George tries to catch the attention of the king who's passing by in a carriage, and he's on the side of the road, and this big crowd of other boys and young men who are trying to do the same. I noticed that the styling of these men were actually quite different, including things very contemporary to the 17th century or the early 17th century, like love locks, which I'm not sure George ever actually had, but like they looked more like they were from the period. But what this then means is that George stands out in the crowd of clamouring twinks, who we as a modern audience don't find the other men around him as attractive as George. And I think the same can really be said for George's main competition for the king in the earlier parts of the show, the Earl of Somerset, with his like very facial hair that going on, and it's like this has just been a bit of an unorganized ramble of my thoughts on the show. I thoroughly enjoyed watching it. I even got a subscription for a month for Now TV to watch it. For uni, I've been reading so much on 16th, 17th, 18th century male beauty. And so I just had a lot of like unorganized comments and things I wanted to say. I thought the show did a really incredible job at explaining some themes and ideas around historical sex and gender that is easily read and understood by a modern audience. I thought, like, I loved the cast, and I think the costume designer did a really good job. It's really hard to have a show that conveys themes that are important to history without it being too stiff or just at the other end of the spectrum ends up being fantasy. So thank you for watching, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on the show.